Picture this, the year is 1457, the heart of a brutal English winter. Snow lashes against the stone walls of Pembroke Castle in Wales, the icy wind screaming through arrow slits and battering the fortress perched high above the sea. Inside those cold walls, a single chamber flickers with the faint glow of candles and the thick scent of burning herbs. The air is heavy with whispers, prayers, and the quiet dread of women who have seen too many mothers lost in childbirth. In that chamber lies a girl of only 13 years old, Lady Margaret Beaufort, her frail body locked in a battle between life and death. She clutches at blood-soaked sheets as her body convulses with waves of agony, each one more punishing than the last. Her cries, once loud, are growing weaker, her voice spent after hours of pain. The midwives, experienced women who have brought countless children into the world, exchange grim looks. They know this child laborer is dangerously young, her body still too small, her hips too narrow. The girl writhing on that bed is no ordinary child. Margaret Beaufort carries in her veins the blood of kings, her lineage tied directly to John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. But in this moment, royal blood is no protection. It is a curse as much as a blessing because it has forced her into this chamber, into this ordeal for the sake of dynastic ambition. Her husband Edmund Tudor, already dead and gone, will never see the child that his young bride is now struggling to deliver. The child is positioned badly inside her, the physician mutters. And even with prayers to Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of women in labor survival, is far from certain. The women tending her move swiftly. They boil water, scatter lavender and rosemary to mask the stench of blood and fear, and clutch relics said to shield mothers in danger. One midwife rubs Margaret's back with oil, whispering encouragement that rings hollow in the midst of such torment. The castle physician, Master Carlion, stands by, his eyes grave. He has studied in Oxford and Paris, and yet here, faced with the frailty of a child's body straining to produce life, his learning seems like dust. He knows the odds. Too often both mother and child are lost. Hour after hour passes. The great stone keep outside grows colder, frost creeping along its windows, while inside the screams of a girl echo off the chamber walls. Her body is stretched to breaking point, her spirit clinging to faith in the God she prays to between cries. At one point her lips murmur half prayers, half bargains. If she lives, if her child lives, she will dedicate herself wholly to God. In that vow lies the seed of the woman. She will one day become pious to the point of obsession, relentless in her sense of divine mission. At last, when even the midwives begin to fear that life is slipping away, a cry cuts through the room. Not Margaret's, but that of a newborn child. A thin, fragile wail that pierces the silence and draws tears from the women who had been preparing themselves to mourn. They lift the bloodied, gasping infant into the air and announce the birth of Henry Tudor, a boy who will one day wear the crown of England. Margaret, pale as wax, lies half-conscious, her body broken beyond repair by the ordeal. She reaches weakly toward her son, her eyes glassy with exhaustion, but she cannot hold him. For only a moment the infant is laid on her chest, the warmth of his tiny body pressing against hers before he is whisked away to be cleaned and swaddled. That moment, the first touch of mother and child, becomes etched in her mind, a fleeting connection in a life where separation will be the rule rather than the exception. But this victory is bittersweet. Margaret has survived, though just barely, and the physician knows the damage is lasting. Her body has been torn and reshaped in ways that mean she will never safely bear another child. At 13, her childbearing years are already over. Her womb, once seen as a vessel for dynastic hopes, has been sacrificed to produce this single fragile boy. The price of England's future has been extracted from her body in blood and agony. Outside the chamber, Margaret's brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, paces the corridors of Pembroke Castle, his boots echoing on the flagstones. He knows the importance of what has just happened. In that chamber, through the suffering of a child mother, a new hope for the Lancastrian cause has been born. England is already splintering into civil war, the red rose of Lancaster set against the white rose of York. This newborn child, Henry Tudor, may someday become more than just a boy. He may become the thread that ties a fractured kingdom back together. But in this moment no one speaks of destiny, only survival. The mother lies torn and trembling, her lips whispering prayers of thanks even as fever already threatens her. The child, swaddled and pale, whimpers softly beside the fire. Around them the women clean the blood from the stone floor, burn the soiled linens, and pray in silence for both to live through the night. Few who were present in that chamber could have imagined what had just begun. They saw only a broken girl, a widow of 13, her body ruined by childbirth. They saw only a fragile boy gasping for life in a world where infant mortality was a daily reality. They could not yet know that this moment, this scream in the dead of winter, would echo through English history, that the girl would transform her suffering into ruthless determination, and that the boy would grow to claim the throne as Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. For now, Pembroke Castle remained cloaked in silence, save for the crackle of fire and the faint cries of a newborn. The Atlantic winds continued to howl against its walls, carrying away the sound of Margaret's agony into the night. The Wars of the Roses had already begun to stir, and with them the long road that would make this broken girl into one of the most formidable women in English history. Long before that night of agony in Pembroke Castle, Margaret Beaufort had been marked by destiny. She was born in May of 1443, a world already unsteady, where power shifted like sand beneath the feet of nobles. Her blood carried the weight of centuries, for she was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, son of King Edward III. In that one connection lay both her value and her curse. In 15th century, England lineage was both shield and weapon. It could open the doors of power, but it could just as swiftly paint a target on one's back. From her earliest days, Margaret was reminded of this fact. She was not simply a child to be cherished. She was an heiress, a piece on the great chessboard of England's politics. The adults who surrounded her did not see her laughter or her play in the gardens of Bletsoe Castle. They saw the blood of kings, a heritage that could bind families together or tear them apart. She was an only child, and that made her all the more precious. She was not just Margaret. She was Lancaster's future, bound up in the body of a small girl. But destiny often begins in tragedy. Margaret's father, John Beaufort, the first Duke of Somerset, was a man broken by war. He had commanded English forces during the waning years of the 100 Years' War, watching helplessly as the glory won by Henry V dissolved piece by piece in France. Once English kings had dreamed of ruling Paris itself. By the time Beaufort returned to England, those dreams lay in ruins. Town after town had fallen. Defeat gnawed at him like a cancer. When he came back in 1444, courtiers whispered of a hollow-eyed man, trembling, haunted, consumed by shame. The end came swiftly. On May 27th of that same year, John Beaufort was found dead in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official record named fever, yet in the corridors of power few believed it. Suicide. Some whispered an unthinkable act for a man of his rank, but one that matched his despair. Others muttered of poison, for poison was the shadow that lingered behind every noble death in those days. Whether by blade cup or his own hand, Margaret's father had chosen death over disgrace. For the infant Margaret, not yet walking, the scandal of his demise hung over her like a storm cloud she would never escape. His death left her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, with the enormous burden of securing her daughter's future in a world where women and children survived only through alliances. The widow moved quickly, understanding what so many noble women did. A girl's worth was measured not in her innocence or her joy, but in the contracts her hand could seal. By the time Margaret was 6, she was already betrothed, promised to a boy she had never met, John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. It was not a promise of affection, it was a bargain of blood. To the little girl running through castle halls, it must have seemed bewildering. But in 15th century England, such bargains were as common as sunrise. Children were pawns long before they were players. Margaret was bound her life, charted by ink on parchment, her future as much a commodity as a bag of coin. Yet fate was fickle. The de la Pole alliance collapsed when William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, himself fell from grace. He had been accused of treachery, of handing French territories back to the enemy, of arranging the unpopular marriage between Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. He was hated, condemned as a traitor, and in 1450, while attempting to cross the English Channel into exile, Suffolk met his end in a manner that burned itself into legend. Dragged from his ship by pirates or assassins, depending on who told the story, he was forced to kneel, his neck bent against the rail. His captors wielded a rusty sword. It took them half a dozen blows to sever his head. The sea turned red as his body was cast into the waves. For Margaret's family, the contract that had once seemed so solid was now worthless, torn apart with his mutilated corpse. It was a brutal lesson for the girl. No promise, no betrothal, no alliance was safe. Survival required adaptability. The ink on a contract meant little when men's fortunes could collapse overnight. For Margaret Beaufort, this was the beginning of her education in the ruthless world of dynastic politics. She would carry those lessons with her, always the fragility of power, the thin line between honor and disgrace, the reality that noble blood made one both precious and expendable. As the Wars of the Roses loomed on the horizon, Margaret's bloodline placed her at the heart of a conflict she had never chosen. A pawn on a board set for war, she was already being moved toward a fate that would test her beyond imagining. By the time Margaret Beaufort reached her 12th year, her life had already been rewritten more times than most people twice her age. Her father's disgrace and death had left her a solitary heiress. Her first betrothal to John de la Pole had vanished in blood and betrayal when his father was butchered on the sea. Yet in the shifting sands of English politics, one truth never changed. Margaret's value lay in her womb and in her bloodline. And so another arrangement was made. The Beaufort women, her widowed mother Margaret Beauchamp, and other guardians of her fate, knew that every marriage was a gamble of survival. The girl was never asked if she wished to marry or whom. Her feelings mattered less than a signature on a contract, less than the alliances it might secure. In 15th century, England noble daughters were chess pieces in a game played by men at court and on the battlefield. Margaret was now moved to a new square on the board. The man chosen for her was Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. To understand why, one must understand the Tudors themselves. They were newcomers to the great game, outsiders of sorts. Edmund and his brother Jasper were the sons of Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier who had captured the heart of Catherine of Valois, widow of King Henry V. Their secret marriage had scandalized the nobility. To the great lords of England, Catherine's union with a Welshman of humble birth was an outrage. Yet from that scandal rose two men who would shape the destiny of England, Jasper and Edmund Tudor, legitimized and elevated by Henry VI, who recognized them as his half-brothers and rewarded them with earldoms. Edmund was no prince in the traditional sense. He was not raised on tales of ancient bloodlines or lands stretching back to the conquest. His family's legitimacy was questioned by many, their nobility dismissed as a creation of the king's whim. But in the politics of the 1452nd, one thing mattered more than legitimacy: proximity to the crown. Edmund Tudor had the king's favour, and that made him valuable. And so in 1455 the match was made. Margaret, a girl scarcely past her 12th birthday, stood before the altar and became the wife of Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. The ceremony took place in her family's own stronghold at Bletsoe, amid the banners and tapestries that told of her ancestors' glory. It was a marriage of political calculation, but to Margaret it was the end of childhood. Imagine her still a child herself, clothed in fine fabric but small for her age, reciting vows she could barely understand. Edmund Tudor, a man in his mid-20s, seasoned by war and the brutal realities of politics, took her hand. There was no talk of waiting, no protection for her youth. In the eyes of the nobility she was a bride, and brides were meant to produce heirs. The wedding night was not the tender consummation of love stories. It was a transaction, a duty forced upon her body, one that left scars deeper than any seen by the eye. Margaret never spoke openly of those first nights with Edmund Tudor, but the consequences became visible soon enough. Before long, whispers spread through the castle corridors that the child bride was with child herself. Her body, still narrow and fragile, began to swell with life it was scarcely able to contain. The women around her murmured in awe and anxiety. For the Beauforts and Tudors, this was cause for celebration, the continuation of a line, the strengthening of bonds. For Margaret's mother, it was a torment to watch her daughter carry such a burden at such a tender age. She herself had been 18 when Margaret was born, strong enough to endure childbirth with reasonable safety. But 13 was different. 13 was too young. Meanwhile, Edmund was called to arms. The country was already fracturing. The first shots of the Wars of the Roses had been fired. Edmund marched to Wales to defend the Lancastrian cause, leaving his young bride behind to face her ordeal alone. His absence would soon become permanent. In 1456, while campaigning, Edmund Tudor was captured by Yorkist forces and imprisoned in Carmarthen Castle. Within weeks he was dead. Plague, his captors said, but to many the swiftness of his death smacked of murder, of quiet removal for political convenience. And so Margaret's brief marriage ended as abruptly as it had begun. At 13 years old she was already a widow, already pregnant, already cast into the centre of dynastic struggle. The political game had claimed her childhood, her innocence and her safety. She was no longer simply Margaret Beaufort. She was the bearer of an heir, the vessel through which Lancaster might continue to fight for its crown. The board was reset. The pawn had been moved forward. And Margaret's life was about to be transformed by the most harrowing trial of all her labour at Pembroke Castle, where the screams of a girl would give birth to a dynasty. When Margaret Beaufort became the bride of Edmund Tudor, the match was more than the union of two people. It was the binding of dynastic hopes, in a time of chaos. England in the mid-15th century was teetering towards civil war. The crown was weakened under the troubled reign of Henry VI, a king prone to bouts of madness and indecision. In such a climate, marriage was not a private affair. It was a weapon, a shield, and sometimes a trap. For Margaret, it was all three. The Tudors themselves were an unusual family, recent arrivals to the ranks of nobility. Their father, Owen Tudor, had begun life as a Welsh soldier and courtier. By charm, audacity, and perhaps love, he won the hand of Catherine of Valois, widow of Henry V. The marriage was secret, conducted in defiance of expectations, and when it came to light, the court gasped at the audacity of a Welsh commoner taking a queen as wife. Yet that union produced sons Edmund and Jasper Tudor, whom King Henry VI acknowledged as his half-brothers. Through royal favour, Edmund was made Earl of Richmond, Jasper Earl of Pembroke. Their noble standing was not the ancient kind carried in coats of arms for centuries. It was the fragile kind granted by a king's goodwill. Still, in a kingdom where proximity to the crown mattered more than bloodlines written in parchment, the Tudors had risen fast. For the Beauforts, with their lineage reaching back to Edward, the third marriage into the Tudor line offered something Margaret's guardians valued: security under the king's gaze. For Edmund, marriage to a Beaufort heiress gave him a claim of his own, a strengthening of his family's place among the nobility. And so in 1455 the match was sealed. Margaret was 12. Edmund was in his mid-20s. The difference in years was not unusual by the standards of the time, but it was stark nonetheless. She was scarcely more than a child, still growing into her frame, her hair still the glossy mane of girlhood. He was a man who had walked battlefields, attended councils, and knew the blunt language of politics. Where she had been taught to stitch embroidery and read prayers, he had been trained to hold a sword and to maneuver among ambitious men. The marriage was conducted with ceremony, as all noble marriages were. Banners flew and tapestries told of Beaufort victories of old. The vows were spoken in the echoing chapel, where stone effigies of ancestors lay watching from their tombs. But no words spoken that day could erase the truth. This was no union of equals. Margaret was entering a world she had no power to refuse, a contract written upon her body, rather than signed with her hand. In the quiet that followed the wedding feasts, Margaret's ordeal began. In the 15th century, there was no concept of waiting for maturity, no thought to spare the body of a girl not yet fully grown. The marriage was consummated at once, as was expected, and the trauma of that night marked her for the rest of her life. She would rarely, if ever, speak of it in her later years. But the silence itself tells the story. It was not romance that came to her in that chamber, but pain and fear endured for the sake of family ambition. Within months, the proof of consummation appeared. Margaret was with child. To her family and Edmund's allies, this was cause for celebration, the promise of an heir. To Margaret herself, it was a sentence. Her body was scarcely capable of supporting a pregnancy, her hips narrow, her frame slight. Every glance at her growing belly carried both pride and dread. The women of her household exchanged anxious looks behind her back. Her own mother must have remembered her own labor at 18, and known with mounting terror how much more dangerous it was for a girl of 12. Yet fate dealt Margaret another blow. While she carried Edmund's child, Edmund himself was lost. In 1456, while leading campaigns in Wales for the Lancastrian cause, he was taken prisoner by Yorkist forces. The country was already boiling toward open war, the rival houses of York and Lancaster circling each other like wolves. At Carmarthen Castle, Edmund was confined, and soon after he was dead. Some said plague claimed him. Others whispered that his death was too sudden, too convenient, that it bore the marks of murder. The truth may never be known, but for Margaret the result was inescapable. She was 13, pregnant, and a widow. The marriage that had been arranged to secure her future had left her with no protector and a child to bring into a world already trembling with civil war. It was at this moment in the bleak winter of her life that Jasper Tudor stepped forward. Edmund's younger brother, only in his 20s, took Margaret under his protection. It was a practical decision. She carried the heir to the Tudor line, but it was also an act of loyalty. Jasper brought her to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle, where stone walls rose against the bitter winds off the sea. There, in the depths of winter, Margaret would face the most dangerous trial of her young life. The journey itself was torment. The roads were thick with mud and frozen ruts, rivers swollen by rain, the land roamed by soldiers whose allegiances shifted with the season. Margaret, heavy with child, was borne in a litter, jostled and shaken with every mile. The cold gnawed at her bones. The fear of capture by Yorkist men-at-arms haunted every shadow. By the time she reached the fortress on its limestone cliffs, she was exhausted, her body near collapse. Pembroke Castle was a place of strength, not comfort. Its walls, thick and ancient, offered protection from enemies, but little warmth from the gales that tore off the Atlantic. In its chambers, tapestries strained to keep out the draughts, and fires roared endlessly to beat back the cold. For Margaret, it became both prison and sanctuary, the place where she would endure her transformation from girl to mother. And so in the heart of that winter, Margaret's ordeal began in earnest. Her body, still more child than woman, prepared to bring forth life. And all the while, beyond the castle walls, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York sharpened their thorns, readying for the war that would claim thousands. By the time Margaret Beaufort settled within the fortress walls of Pembroke Castle, she was no longer merely a young bride, but a widow. Edmund Tudor, the man to whom she had been married, scarcely a year was gone. Captured in Wales by Yorkist forces and imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle, he had withered away in the space of a few weeks. His captors claimed plague had carried him off, but few believed such a convenient explanation. In an age when every sudden death of a nobleman carried the stench of intrigue, whispers of deliberate murder spread quickly. Margaret never knew the truth. What she did know was that she was 13, pregnant and alone. The blow was devastating, but it was not one she could afford to dwell on. In the brutal landscape of 15th century politics, grief had no place unless it could be used as currency. Edmund's death stripped her of a husband's protection, leaving her more vulnerable than ever. But it also left her with something infinitely more dangerous, the unborn heir of the Tudor line. That child was now both her burden and her shield. It was Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, who stepped into the role of guardian. Jasper was in his mid-20s, loyal, ambitious, and sharp-eyed enough to recognize that his sister-in-law carried more than just a child. She carried the future of their family's fragile legacy. By bringing her to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle, perched high above the crashing waves of Milford Haven, Jasper ensured that both mother and unborn heir were wrapped in layers of stone and armed protection. The journey to Pembroke was perilous in itself. Winter was closing in, the roads churned with frozen ruts and muddy bogs, while swollen rivers threatened to sweep away wagons and riders alike. Margaret was carried in a litter, her small body strained by pregnancy, every jolt and bump an agony. She was still only 13, her frame narrow and delicate, her skin pale from both grief and the physical strain of carrying a child. The women who travelled with her whispered prayers not only for safe passage, but for her survival in the months to come. Pembroke Castle was no warm refuge. Its great limestone walls loomed over the sea, a fortress built for endurance rather than comfort. The keep itself rose nearly 80 feet, a towering sentinel that had withstood centuries of storms and sieges. But within its chambers were cold and draughty, the wind clawing through every crack in the stone. Fires burned day and night, devouring cartloads of timber, yet the chill seeped into the bones of all who lived there. For Margaret, the discomfort was secondary to the weight she carried. Her pregnancy advanced each day, stretching her body further beyond what it was meant to endure. The castle physician, Master Carleon, examined her with furrowed brow and reluctant honesty. Her hips were too narrow, the baby too large, the risks too high. He confided his fears in Jasper, whispering in the dim light of the solar that this birth might claim her life. He had seen girls die in childbed before, too young, too small, their bodies torn apart by ambition that demanded heirs before nature had granted readiness. Margaret herself must have known the danger. Each night she prayed in the chapel, her small frame bent on the cold stone floor, murmuring promises to God that if he spared her and her child, she would devote her life to his service. Already her piety was deepening into something more than ritual, for her faith became a shield against the terror of what lay ahead. The chapel's shadows must have seemed her truest confidants, as she whispered vows into the silence. Vows that would define her life long after this nightmarish season had passed. And yet, even in this peril, Margaret's mind was not idle. Perhaps it was Jasper's influence, or perhaps her own nature, but she began to watch and listen closely to the currents of power around her. She was young but not naive. She learned to read the expressions of those who visited Jasper's hall, to weigh the shifting loyalties of knights and lords who came seeking favours or whispering news. The Wars of the Roses were beginning to ignite in earnest, York and Lancaster sharpening blades for a conflict that would engulf the kingdom. Margaret understood, even at 13, that her child might be more than a son. He might be a banner, a rallying cry, a threat. As the days shortened and the winter winds howled around Pembroke, Margaret's world narrowed to the chamber where she awaited her ordeal. Every movement of the child within her reminded her of the approaching storm. Servants brought broth and herbs, but her appetite was faint. The physician checked her pulse, frowning more often than he smiled. Jasper paced the halls at night, listening to the sea batter, the cliffs, knowing that the fate of his family, perhaps even of England, was tied to the survival of a girl scarcely old enough to be called a woman. Widowhood had changed Margaret, stripping her of childish illusions in a matter of weeks. She had been a bride in a world of tapestries and vows, but now she was a vessel of dynastic ambition, an heiress with no husband, a mother with no certainty of survival. The girl who entered Pembroke Castle was not the same girl who would emerge from it. By the time the winds of January brought the pangs of labour to her frail body, Margaret Beaufort had already been forged in the fire of loss. What came next would temper her into iron. The winter of 1457 was a cruel one. Gales from the Atlantic battered the cliffs of Pembroke, and the castle groaned under the assault of wind and sea spray. Within its thick walls fires burned in great hearths, yet the cold never truly retreated. It clung to the stones, seeped into the bones of those who dwelt there, and reminded them daily that survival, not comfort, was the castle's true purpose. For Margaret Beaufort, barely 13, and heavily pregnant, that bitter season became the crucible in which her fate and England's was decided. Her condition was already precarious. The physician, Master Carleon, had measured her narrow hips and shaken his head. He whispered warnings to Jasper Tudor, in the dim light of the castle solar. The child was large, he said, and positioned badly. Margaret was too small, her body not yet fully formed for womanhood. The dangers were great: prolonged labour, tearing, bleeding death. Carleon had seen such cases before, and too often they ended with 2 corpses instead of 1 heir. Jasper listened, his face grave, but what choice did they have? The child would come whether they were ready or not. Margaret herself faced the prospect with a faith that was fierce, almost unearthly. She prayed constantly, kneeling for hours in the cold chapel, her lips forming Latin words she barely understood, bargaining with God. If he allowed her to survive, if he spared her son, she would devote herself entirely to his service. To some it seemed the desperate vows of a frightened girl. To others it was the beginning of a lifelong devotion that would come to define her. And so on a storm-lashed night in January the pains began. At first they came like distant thunder waves of pressure and tearing that left her gasping. She had been walking slowly along the battlements at the physician's insistence when the first contraction doubled her over. Servants rushed to her side, carrying her back to her chamber where the midwives were already waiting, faces grim with knowledge of what lay ahead. The chamber filled quickly. Braziers hissed with burning herbs, lavender to calm rosemary, to give strength rue to ward off evil. The midwives laid out their tools, knives for cutting the cord hooks and forceps for darker purposes, clean linen for swaddling relics of saints to call upon divine mercy. Dame Gwen, the head midwife, took command. She had delivered children for 30 years, learned the secret tricks of turning a breech baby, of coaxing life into the stillborn. Yet as she examined Margaret, her lined face grew grave. This was no ordinary case. This was a child forced to give birth to a child. The hours dragged into agony. Margaret's screams echoed through the stone corridors, rising and falling like the wind outside. Servants passed with basins of hot water, their eyes lowered, their faces pale. Jasper Tudor paced outside the chamber door, listening to every cry, as though each were a blade driven into his own body. In the chapel, Father Meredith knelt, praying without cease, his voice hoarse from repetition of psalms. Inside, the battle raged. Margaret writhed on the bed, her hair plastered to her face with sweat, her hands clawing at the sheets until they tore. Blood stained the linens, thick and frightening. The midwives tried everything, changing her position, massaging her belly, chanting prayers to saints long called upon in childbirth. Dame Gwen whispered encouragement in her ear, telling her she was strong, that God was with her, that she would live to see her child. Yet the truth was plain in her eyes, the girl's strength was waning. 18 hours passed. Margaret's voice broke until only hoarse gasps escaped her lips. Her skin grew pale as parchment, her pulse weak. The physician, summoned from uneasy sleep, leaned close and listened to the faint, irregular heartbeat of the child within. He exchanged looks with Dame Gwen. If they did nothing, both might die. If they attempted intervention, they risked killing Margaret outright. There was no good choice, only the least terrible. With hands steady from long practice, Dame Gwen prepared to guide the child into the world by force. She prayed silently to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patroness of women in labor, as she reached within the girl's torn body. Margaret bit down on a strip of linen to keep from screaming as the midwife worked. The chamber was filled with the scent of blood, sweat, and burning herbs, a suffocating mixture that pressed upon every soul present. And then at last the moment came. The infant, slick with blood and birth fluid, was pulled free into the world. For a heartbeat there was silence. The child was pale, motionless, as if the ordeal had stolen its life. Then Dame Gwen cleared its mouth, rubbed its chest, and a thin, angry wail pierced the air. The room exhaled as one. Henry Tudor had been born. Margaret, nearly unconscious, turned her head weakly toward the sound. Her lips moved in a whisper, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a name, but her strength was gone. The midwives placed the tiny boy upon her chest for a fleeting moment, then carried him to the fire to be cleaned and swaddled. Margaret's eyes followed him, desperately imprinting his face upon her memory, even as the darkness of exhaustion closed around her. The ordeal had ended, but its cost was immense. Margaret's body was broken, her flesh torn, and her insides damaged in ways that would never heal. Master Carlion knew at once she would never bear another child. This birth, wrung from her too young body, was both her first and her last. She had given England a son, but at the price of her own womanhood. In the silence that followed, as the storm raged beyond the castle walls, Margaret Beaufort lay shattered in body but not in spirit. Her son had lived. She had lived. And from that night of pain and blood would rise a dynasty that would one day wear the crown of England. When dawn finally broke over Pembroke Castle, the sea still roared against the cliffs, and the icy wind still rattled the shutters. Inside Margaret's chamber the air was thick with smoke from burnt herbs, the scent of blood still lingering beneath it. The midwives sat slumped in exhaustion, their hands raw from hours of labor. In the cradle by the fire, a small child whimpered a miracle in swaddling cloth. Henry Tudor had survived the night. His mother had too, but barely. Margaret Beaufort lay pale as marble, her body ravaged beyond repair. Master Carlion, the castle physician, moved quietly about the chamber, whispering his findings to Jasper Tudor. His words were grim, torn flesh, internal injuries, blood loss that had drained her to the edge of death. He had seen noble women injured in childbirth before, but Margaret's case was worse than most. The truth was inescapable. She would never safely bear another child. The line of Beaufort and Tudor had been reduced to a single boy born of a single agonizing birth. At 13 years old, Margaret's childbearing years were over before they had properly begun. The weeks that followed were a battle of survival. Fever haunted her, a constant threat in an age where infection could kill even the strongest. Carleon tried every remedy in his arsenal, bloodletting to balance the humours, poultices of herbs to fight the heat in her body, fortified wines spooned between her cracked lips to keep her alive. Dame Gwen, the midwife who had saved her and her child, refused to leave her side. She bathed her, fed her broth, whispered encouragement and prayed when medicine failed. Slowly, against all odds, Margaret clung to life. But survival came at a cost. Her recovery was slow, agonizing. She woke screaming from nightmares of her labor, drenched in sweat, her hands clutching at her stomach as if the pain had returned. She flinched at the touch of others, even her attendants, her body recoiling from physical closeness. And though she longed for her child, the sight of him sometimes brought a flood of memories too sharp to bear the tearing pain, the helplessness, the sound of her own screams echoing in her ears. She loved him desperately, yet her love was bound up with trauma. When she reached for him, it was with trembling hands. In those long months of recovery, something within Margaret hardened. Her body had been broken, but her spirit grew sharper than steel. She understood now that she lived in a world where innocence had no place. She was not merely a widow or a girl. She was the mother of a potential heir. That made her both valuable and vulnerable, a pawn and a prize. She could not afford weakness. If she was to endure in a kingdom descending into civil war, she must turn her suffering into strength. Her prayers became more fervent, her faith deeper. She interpreted her survival as a divine sign, a calling. If God had spared her through this ordeal, then she must live for him and for the child he had given her. This belief, forged in blood and fever, would shape the rest of her life. Margaret would become one of the most devout women in England, her piety bordering on obsession. Yet her religiosity was never merely private. It gave her discipline a framework for endurance, and perhaps most importantly, a shield. A woman wrapped in faith could command respect in ways that a mere widow could not. Even as she healed, Margaret did not sit idle. Under Jasper Tudor's roof, she absorbed lessons of politics and survival. Jasper, recognizing her intelligence, spoke to her of alliances and betrayals, of the shifting loyalties that were already tearing England apart. Margaret listened keenly, storing every detail. She asked questions about law, about governance, about the delicate balances of land and loyalty that underpinned noble power. She was barely into her teens, yet she understood instinctively that knowledge would be her weapon in the years ahead. Her religious devotions deepened alongside her political awareness. Hours in the chapel were spent not only in prayer but in study. Father Meredith, the castle priest, guided her through scripture and theology, but also spoke candidly of how faith intersected with power. He told her that prayer without action was hollow, that God often worked through human hands. These lessons took root in Margaret's mind, reinforcing her growing conviction that survival demanded both piety and calculation. By the time the spring thaw loosened the grip of winter on Pembroke, Margaret Beaufort was no longer merely a fragile girl who had endured a near-fatal childbirth. She was something else entirely. Her body bore scars that would never heal. Her youth had been stripped from her in a single night, but her will was stronger than ever. She had faced death and survived. She had brought forth a son who might one day carry a crown, and she had begun to understand in the quiet hours of pain and prayer that her path through life would not be guided by chance or comfort, but by relentless purpose. The girl who had screamed in agony was gone. In her place stood a young widow whose faith was iron, whose mind was sharpening like a blade, and whose heart beat with a single determination to protect her son at all costs, and to carve a future for him in a kingdom already drowning in blood. When Margaret Beaufort emerged from her long convalescence, she was no longer a child. At 13, she had endured trials that would have broken women twice her age. She had buried a husband, nearly lost her life in childbirth, and brought into the world a son who, though still an infant, already carried the weight of dynastic expectation. Yet the world around her offered no pause for recovery. England was sliding deeper into chaos. The rivalry between the houses of York and Lancaster, long simmering, had burst into open conflict. The Wars of the Roses had begun, and in this storm Margaret could not drift alone. For women of her station, survival came in the form of marriage. Widowhood left her, exposed her lands vulnerable, her son a tempting pawn. Thus, scarcely a year after Henry Tudor's birth, Margaret's guardians arranged another union. This time the match was with Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. The choice was deliberate and pragmatic. Stafford was a man of respectable lineage, connected to one of the wealthiest families in England, and most importantly, he leaned toward the Yorkist cause. It was a dangerous balance. Margaret, through her Beaufort blood, was aligned with Lancaster, the Red Rose. Stafford's sympathies were with York, the White Rose. Yet, in a time when allegiances shifted with terrifying speed, the marriage offered a kind of shield. By binding herself to a Yorkist household, Margaret reduced suspicion of her Lancastrian loyalties. For Stafford, the marriage brought not only Beaufort wealth, but also a connection to a woman whose son Henry might one day serve as a Lancastrian figurehead. For Margaret herself, the marriage meant safety, however fragile, and the chance to secure her estates and her child's inheritance. The ceremony was quiet, lacking the pageantry that had marked her first marriage. There were no grand banquets, no dazzling tournaments. This was not a union forged for celebration, but for survival. Margaret, still frail from the ordeal of childbirth, entered her new marriage with little expectation of affection. Stafford was no Edmund Tudor. Their union was more partnership than passion, but it granted her what she needed most: protection. What Margaret gained during this marriage, however, was not merely safety. It was education. Stafford, though not a towering figure in politics, was practical, worldly, and cautious. Through him, Margaret began to learn the intricate mechanics of estate management. She observed how revenues were collected, how lands were leased, how disputes among tenants were resolved. She studied account rolls and charters, absorbing the language of governance, as if it were scripture. The Beaufort estate, sizable and scattered, required constant oversight. Margaret, still a teenager, threw herself into this work with an intensity that startled those around her. Yet it was not only financial skill she cultivated. Margaret also learned the subtler art of politics. She watched how Stafford navigated his position, cautious in word, prudent in allegiance. She learned how to speak carefully, how to conceal convictions beneath polite indifference, how to survive in a court where a misplaced word could invite ruin. It was in a sense another kind of armor, one as valuable as chainmail. During these years, Margaret also deepened her intellectual pursuits. She read not only devotional texts but works of history and law. Books in Latin and French entered her library, volumes of theology sat beside chronicles of past kings. Though women of her rank were rarely encouraged to study beyond scripture, Margaret seemed insatiable in her curiosity. Knowledge became another weapon, another means of fortifying herself against the uncertain world. Her devotion to faith too intensified. Having vowed to dedicate herself to God if she survived childbirth, Margaret held firm to that promise. She endowed chapels, commissioned prayers, and maintained a rigorous spiritual routine. Yet her piety was not the cloistered kind. It was practical, intertwined with politics. Faith gave her discipline, yes, but it also gave her authority. In a society that revered sanctity, Margaret's reputation as a deeply religious woman lent her both respect and influence. Through Stafford, Margaret also glimpsed the brutal reality of war. Battles like St. Albans and Towton shattered the illusion of stability. The throne changed hands, kings were crowned and dethroned, nobles were slain or exiled. The land itself seemed soaked in blood, its fields turned into graveyards. From the relative safety of her estates, Margaret saw what war meant for families like hers. Fortunes could vanish overnight. A single defeat could turn a loyal servant into a traitor. A victory could transform an obscure name into one that echoed across the realm. All the while, Henry Tudor remained in the custody of Jasper, raised in the relative safety of Wales. Margaret saw her son rarely, and each parting was a wound. She sent him small gifts, books, clothes, tokens of a mother's love, while she poured her frustrated affections into letters and prayers. The separation was bitter, but it was necessary. To keep Henry alive, he had to remain in hiding, protected by walls and loyal men. To keep herself alive, she had to tread carefully in a world where her son's very existence was a threat to those in power. In these years, Margaret transformed herself. She was no longer the broken girl of Pembroke, nor the helpless widow of Carmarthen. She was a wife, a landholder, a politician in training, a mother fighting from a distance. Every lesson she absorbed about money, about alliances, about survival, was another stone in the foundation of the formidable woman she was becoming. If the Wars of the Roses were a storm, then Margaret was learning how to build a ship that could weather it. She was still young, still bound by the expectations of others, but already she was charting her course. And always at the center of her thoughts was her son, Henry. The boy born in agony, the fragile thread of Lancaster's hope. For him Margaret endured. For him she learned. For him she hardened her will into iron. The 1462nd were years of blood and uncertainty. England was no longer a kingdom at peace, but a battlefield where the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York clashed again and again. For Margaret Beaufort, these years were marked by absence. Her son Henry, the child she had nearly died to bring into the world, grew up far from her side under the protection of Jasper Tudor in Wales. For a mother who had endured so much to give him life, the separation was torment, yet it was also the only way to keep him alive. Henry's childhood was shaped by the rugged land of Pembrokeshire, its cliffs battered by the sea, its hills dotted with stone keeps and small villages. Under Jasper's watch he was raised not as a pampered princeling but as a boy who must learn to survive. He learned to ride, to hunt, to wield a sword. He learned Welsh as easily as English, absorbing the rhythms of the countryside and the loyalty of men who saw in him not just a noble child but a symbol of resistance against Yorkist power. For Margaret, these lessons were both a comfort and a wound. She knew her son was safe in Jasper's care, but she could not help but ache at the thought of his first words, his first steps, his first lessons, moments she would never witness. She saw him only rarely, perhaps once or twice a year, when war and circumstance allowed. Those brief meetings were bittersweet. She would look at him with a hunger born of separation, memorizing every detail of his face, his voice, his laugh. Then, just as quickly, he would be gone again, carried back into the safety of Jasper's keeping, leaving Margaret with only the echo of his presence. To bridge the distance, she wrote letters carefully worded, often in code for fear of interception. She sent him small gifts, a devotional book, a token clothes stitched by her own hand. Each gift was an attempt to remind him of a mother he barely knew, to tether him to her across the miles. Meanwhile, Margaret's own world was filled with shifting allegiances and constant danger. The Wars of the Roses were unpredictable, their battles sudden and savage. At Towton in 1461, the bloodiest clash of them all. An estimated 50,000 men fought on a snow-covered field, and nearly half were left dead or dying. For Margaret, the news of such carnage was more than a distant report. It was a reminder that every defeat placed her son in greater peril. The Yorkists under Edward IV now ruled England, and any Lancastrian heir was a threat. Henry, though still a boy, represented a claim to the throne that York would not ignore. Margaret responded as she always did, with calculation. Though she remained outwardly dutiful in her marriage to Henry Stafford, she carefully concealed her true loyalties. She learned to play the part of a Yorkist wife, speaking cautiously, attending court when required, never revealing the full extent of her Lancastrian sympathies. Yet beneath the surface, she worked tirelessly to secure her son's inheritance. She guarded her Beaufort estates with an iron grip, ensuring that lands and wealth would one day pass to Henry. She nurtured quiet alliances with those who still supported Lancaster, especially among the networks of women, wives, sisters and widows who shared information and plotted behind the scenes while their husbands fought in the field. These female networks became Margaret's lifeline. She corresponded with noblewomen on both sides of the conflict, cultivating relationships that might one day prove useful. She understood something many men overlooked, that women, though barred from the battlefield, wielded influence in letters, in households, in the exchange of news. Margaret of Anjou, queen to the Lancastrian Henry VI, became one such figure of inspiration, though she too was vilified as a foreign interloper. Elizabeth Woodville, the Yorkist queen, was another. Her marriage to Edward IV had shocked the nobility, but it showed Margaret how swiftly fortune could change, and how unexpected alliances could alter the course of history. Margaret's daily life may have seemed quiet compared to the thunder of battle, but it was anything but passive. She managed vast estates, balancing rents and accounts with the precision of a steward. She oversaw retainers, negotiated disputes, and ensured that her lands remained productive even in times of war. Every coin she safeguarded, every acre she defended, was not merely wealth for its own sake. It was a future secured for her son, and always she watched the horizon. Each rumor of rebellion, each shift in power at court was weighed for what it might mean for Henry. Was it safe for him to return? Should he remain in hiding? Could he one day be brought forward as a figurehead for the Lancastrian cause? For most women, these questions would have been overwhelming, but Margaret's mind thrived on such calculations. Her faith gave her strength. Her experience gave her caution. She lived in a constant state of readiness, waiting for the moment when fortune might turn. For now, however, she remained separated from the child she had nearly died to bear. Henry grew taller, stronger, more confident in Wales, while his mother grew harder, wiser, more formidable in England. The bond between them was stretched thin by distance, but it did not break. Margaret's love was relentless, a force as unyielding as the stone walls of Pembroke. She had survived the agony of his birth. She would survive the agony of their separation, and one day she promised herself all of this: the estates, the titles, the very throne of England would be his. The Wars of the Roses ground on a relentless cycle of victories and reversals that seemed to swallow England whole. Margaret Beaufort, though not on the battlefield, lived each shift of fortune with the same urgency as the men who fought in blood and mud. Every battle threatened the fragile survival of her son Henry. Every Lancastrian defeat deepened her peril. In March of 1461, the great clash at Towton marked a turning point. Fought in a blizzard, it was the bloodiest battle ever seen on English soil. Snow turned crimson as thousands of men were cut down. When the carnage ended, Edward of York emerged victorious, claiming the crown as Edward IV. For Margaret, the news was devastating. The Lancastrian king Henry VI had fled. The realm belonged to York, and though she outwardly played the loyal Yorkist wife, her thoughts were consumed by what this meant for her boy in Wales. Henry, scarcely 4 years old, had just become a dangerous heir in exile within his own country. Margaret's response was to tighten her vigilance. She built networks of informants, bribed servants for scraps of information, and paid messengers to carry news swiftly from Wales. She learned how to navigate a world where one careless word could end in ruin. If she was ever accused of treason, her life and her son's life would be forfeit. It was a dangerous game, but Margaret was already becoming a master of it. Then came 1471, a year of devastation for the House of Lancaster. In April, the Battle of Barnet saw the death of Richard Neville, the mighty Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker whose shifting alliances had once restored Henry VI to his throne. 2 weeks later in May, the final hammer blow fell at Tewkesbury. There on that field, the last true Lancastrian prince, Edward of Westminster, was slain. Some say he died in the chaos of battle. Others whisper he was executed after capture. Either way, with his death, the direct Lancastrian line was extinguished. For Margaret, the consequences were profound. With the prince gone, and Henry VI himself murdered shortly thereafter in the Tower of London, the Lancastrian cause was broken. Yet paradoxically, her son Henry, just 14 years old, emerged as the remaining figurehead of Lancaster's claim. It was a fragile, tenuous claim, for it came through the Beaufort line tainted by questions of legitimacy. But in the absence of stronger heirs, Henry became both a hope and a target. Jasper Tudor understood at once the danger. He knew that Edward IV would not tolerate a Lancastrian heir roaming free in Wales. Capture meant certain death, and so he made a desperate choice flight. In the late summer of 1471, as Yorkist forces closed in on Pembroke, Jasper gathered his nephew and a small band of loyal men. Under cover of night, they slipped away to Tenby, a small port town on the Welsh coast. There, with enemies closing in, they boarded a ship bound for Brittany. The voyage was perilous. Storms battered their vessel, and the seas threatened to swallow them whole. For days they were tossed on waves, uncertain if they would ever reach shore. But eventually, battered and weary, they arrived in Brittany, where Duke Francis II offered them precarious refuge. It was not safety, not truly. Henry was now a pawn in the hands of foreign powers, valuable as a bargaining chip with England, but always at risk of betrayal. Yet exile was better than execution. Back in England, Margaret received the news with a mixture of grief and grim determination. Her son was gone not merely across Wales but across the sea, into a land where she could not reach him. The separation that had already marked their relationship widened into an abyss. She did not know if she would ever see him again. Letters might reach him or they might not. Messages might be intercepted. Every day she woke with the same gnawing fear that her son was dead, claimed by illness or by Yorkist assassins. Yet in her grief, Margaret hardened further. If she could not be with Henry, she would work ceaselessly to prepare the world for his return. She studied politics with renewed intensity, sharpened her skills in estate management, and deepened her network of allies. To those at court, she appeared a dutiful wife to Henry Stafford, quiet and pious. But beneath that mask, she became something more dangerous, a strategist. The Margaret who had once been a girl forced into marriage was gone. In her place stood a woman who had been forged by loss, by widowhood, by a childbirth that nearly killed her, and now by the exile of her only son. She no longer prayed only for survival. She prayed for victory, however long it might take, however much it might cost. On a storm-swept night in 1471, as Henry Tudor's ship vanished into the mists of the Channel, Margaret Beaufort understood her destiny more clearly than ever. She could not hold her son in her arms, but she could fight for the crown she believed God had preserved him to wear. From that moment onward, every word she spoke, every alliance she forged, every prayer she whispered was bent toward one end, the restoration of Lancaster through the boy she had nearly died to bring into the world. When the year 1471 closed, Margaret Beaufort stood in a bleak position. Her son was in exile across the Channel, her Lancastrian cause shattered, her second husband, Henry Stafford, ailing and disillusioned after years of bloody conflict. Yet even as fortune turned against her, Margaret refused to yield. If she could not wield a sword, she would wield alliances, letters, and patience with the same sharpness as steel. Henry Stafford lingered a few more months before death claimed him, leaving Margaret widowed for the second time, before she had even reached 30. The loss brought sorrow, but also an opportunity. As a widow, she could choose her next step, or more accurately, she could shape the choice that would secure her survival and her son's future. She might have sought safety in obscurity, marrying a lesser noble who would shield her lands but leave her ambitions to wither. Instead, she reached higher. Her third marriage was to Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, one of the most skilled political survivors of his age. The Stanleys were powerful in the northwest, commanding armies and holding lands that stretched like a fortress across Cheshire and Lancashire. More importantly, Thomas Stanley himself was a master of timing. He had built his reputation not by unshakable loyalty, but by shifting allegiance at precisely the right moment, ensuring he was always on the side of the victor. To some, he was a turncoat. To Margaret, he was a shield and a ladder. The marriage was not one of love, but of calculation. For Stanley's wedding, Margaret brought him the prestige of her Beaufort blood, and the connection to her faraway son whose claim to the throne, though faint, still shimmered with potential. For Margaret, it brought access to Stanley's networks, his intelligence, his soldiers. It meant protection in the treacherous courts of Edward IV, and later Richard III. It meant survival. Their wedding was a spectacle of political theatre. Nobles attended, feasting under banners that displayed both Beaufort and Stanley arms. Edward IV himself approved the union, perhaps believing it wise to keep Margaret within the sight of a man whose loyalty could be swayed with titles and favours. Better to have her tethered to a powerful husband than conspiring alone. Margaret smiled through the ceremony, prayed devoutly at the Mass and said the vows. But beneath her composure, her thoughts burned with the same unyielding focus. This was another step, another shield for her son. Life with Stanley proved pragmatic. They were not lovers, nor did they pretend to be. Their partnership was built on mutual respect and shared caution. Margaret managed her estates and maintained her household with the same diligence as before. Stanley maneuvered in the dangerous world of royal politics, lending support here, withdrawing it there, never fully committing until he saw which way the wind blew. Margaret observed him carefully, learning how he played his game. She absorbed the lesson that survival in turbulent times did not always mean standing firm. It often meant bending just enough to avoid breaking. Yet even as she adjusted to her new life, her mind remained fixed on her son. Henry Tudor, now a teenager in Brittany, lived at the mercy of Duke Francis II. To the Duke, Henry was both guest and hostage, a tool that could be offered to the English king or sheltered for use as a bargaining chip. Margaret's letters to him when they reached across the sea were written in careful code. Simple phrases concealed deeper meanings, religious devotions, masked instructions or warnings. At times she entrusted merchants and pilgrims to carry news, trusting in God that her words would not be intercepted. Her household became the hub of a quiet intelligence network. She cultivated clerics, merchants and courtiers, paying them with coin promises or influence to keep her informed. She knew more than many nobles who sat at council, often hearing of troop movements or political disputes before they reached official ears. Information became her weapon, each letter, each whisper, each coded note, sharpening her hand in the long game of survival. At court, Margaret perfected her mask. She appeared the model of piety, her days filled with prayer, her demeanour humble. She donated to religious houses, funded the copying of devotional books, and presented herself as a woman concerned only with God and her household. To many, she seemed harmless, perhaps even a little tiresome in her endless devotion. Yet this was the perfect disguise. Behind that veil of sanctity, she plotted ceaselessly. She knew her son's exile could not last forever. One day the Yorkist kings would falter, and when that day came, Henry would need allies and resources ready to act. Stanley himself must have known of her ambitions, but he did not interfere. Perhaps he admired her determination, or perhaps he recognized the advantage of having a wife whose son might one day wear a crown. He kept his distance, content to let her play her game so long as it did not threaten his own survival. This unspoken understanding suited them both. Years passed, marked by reversals of fortune in England and tense uncertainty in Brittany. Margaret's position remained precarious, her son still far away. But through prayer, patience, and political maneuvering she endured. Her third marriage had given her something she had never truly possessed before: stability. And with stability came the chance to prepare. Margaret Beaufort, once the broken girl of Pembroke, was now a woman of 30, pious in reputation, formidable in truth. She had buried 2 husbands, survived childbirth that had ruined her body, endured separation from her only child, and navigated the deadliest conflict in England's history. Now, with Stanley at her side and her son growing into manhood abroad, she was poised for the moment when fortune might finally shift. She did not know when or how. But she believed with unshakable conviction that God had preserved her and her son for a purpose. And when that purpose revealed itself, Margaret Beaufort would be ready. By the early 482nd, England once again trembled on the edge of chaos. Edward IV, the Yorkist king, who had seemed so secure upon his throne, died suddenly in 1483 at the age of 40. His heir, the young Edward V, was only 12 years old. The kingdom braced itself for a regency, but the boy never wore his crown. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power in a ruthless coup. Within months, Edward V and his brother Richard were locked away in the Tower of London, and then they vanished. The whispers were swift and poisonous. The boys were dead, smothered, or stabbed in their beds, their uncle the likely culprit. Richard was crowned king as Richard III, but his reign began beneath a dark cloud of suspicion. For Margaret Beaufort, the usurpation was both danger and opportunity. Richard III was ruthless, but he was also despised. For the first time, her son Henry's distant claim to the throne began to look like a viable alternative. He was the last viable Lancastrian heir. The Beaufort bloodline, that had once seemed a liability, now transformed into a lifeline for disaffected nobles. Margaret saw the opening with startling clarity. After decades of waiting, of praying, of maneuvering in shadows, the moment had come to act. She began to plot with breathtaking boldness. Through Bishop John Morton and other allies, she coordinated a rebellion against Richard. She corresponded with exiles, with Henry's supporters abroad, and with discontented lords at home. She even reached out to Elizabeth Woodville, the widowed queen of Edward IV, whose sons had vanished in the Tower. Together they made a pact. Elizabeth's daughter, Elizabeth of York, would wed Henry Tudor. The marriage would unite the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, ending the war that had bled England dry. It was a brilliant plan, but dangerous beyond measure. The rebellion of 1483 failed when betrayal exposed the conspiracy. Margaret's allies were executed, their blood staining London's cobblestones. She herself was spared death only because of her husband Thomas Stanley, whose influence shielded her. Yet Richard did not forgive. Margaret was placed under house arrest, her lands seized, her voice formally silenced. Still, even confined, she did not stop. Through servants' coded letters and whispered promises, she continued to weave her web. Her patience was rewarded 2 years later. In 1485, Henry Tudor, after 14 long years in exile, sailed from France with a small army. He landed at Milford Haven, the very coast near Pembroke, where he had been born in agony 13 years earlier. His return was a gamble. Outnumbered, outmatched, his only hope lay in defections and the faith of men who despised Richard III. But he carried with him not only soldiers and banners, but also the hope Margaret had nurtured for decades. On the 22nd of August 1485, the two armies clashed at Bosworth Field. The battle hung in the balance until Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband, made his fateful choice. For days he had marched with Richard's host, swearing loyalty to the king, but as the fighting reached its height, he turned his men against Richard. It was betrayal at the perfect moment, betrayal. Margaret had quietly prepared with years of persuasion and patience. Surrounded, Richard fought bravely, but was cut down in the mud, the crown snatched from a thorn bush and placed upon Henry's head. At last, Margaret's son was King Henry, the 7th of England, founder of the Tudor dynasty. The girl who had nearly died in childbirth at 13, who had lived as a widow, a political pawn, and a mother from afar, now stood as My Lady the King's mother. She had endured exile, loss, humiliation, and danger. She had prayed, plotted, and survived when so many others had fallen. And now her son sat upon the throne, his right secured not only by blood but by her relentless will. Yet triumph came with its own sacrifices. Margaret never enjoyed the simple bond of mother and child. Years of separation had shaped Henry into a cautious, reserved man wary of intimacy. He respected her, even revered her, but theirs was not the tender relationship of ordinary families. Instead, they were allies, partners in the work of building a dynasty. Margaret threw herself into this role with the same intensity she had shown in youth. She oversaw finances, advised on marriages, and even managed aspects of Henry's court. Her hand was everywhere, subtle, yet unmistakable. She lived long enough to see the fruits of her labor. Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses. Their children included Arthur, Prince of Wales, and Henry the future, Henry VIII. England, exhausted by decades of bloodshed, began to heal under the Tudor banner. Margaret, in her final years, poured her wealth into religion and education. She founded colleges at Cambridge, ensuring her legacy would extend beyond politics into faith and learning. In June 1509, just days after the coronation of her grandson, Henry VIII, Margaret Beaufort died. She was 66 years old, a remarkable age in a time when few lived so long. She was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey beneath a tomb of black marble carved with dignity and power. The Latin inscription praised her devotion and her achievements. Yet no inscription could capture the true measure of her life. The girl who had screamed in agony at Pembroke Castle transformed into the woman who founded a dynasty. Her legacy was written not only in stone but in blood and in iron will. She had given England a king at the cost of her own body. She had sacrificed love, safety, and peace for ambition, cloaked in maternal devotion. The Wars of the Roses had begun before her son's birth, but through him and through her they ended. And so if one listens to the wind that still howls against the cliffs of Pembroke, One might imagine hearing again the echo of that long-ago cry, the scream of a girl in childbirth, the sound that announced the birth of Henry Tudor. A scream of pain, yes, but also the first note of a dynasty that would shape England for a century.